Hey guys, tonight we're plunging straight into a world where crowns glitter under candlelight, but the people who once wore them are suddenly declared enemies of the very thrones they sat upon. Imagine kings who once commanded armies now reduced to fugitives, their names scratched from chronicles, their faces smeared in propaganda, and their very existence turned into a game of hide and seek across continents. You're walking cobblestone alleys at dusk, torchlight flickering, and you hear whispers about kings branded as traitors, outlaws not just to their rivals but to their own people. And here's the kicker, you probably won't survive this kind of royal demotion, because back then being a dethroned monarch was less about exile and more about dodging assassins, bounty hunters, and angry mobs with pitchforks. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. Drop it in the comments so we can see how wide this sleepy little circle stretches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge first into England, where the tale of Edward II still lingers like a ghost behind stone walls. Once a king with a crown heavy on his head, Edward was despised by nobles for favouring close companions like Piers Gaveston, a man historians still argue whether he was merely a political favourite or something more personal. His barons rebelled, his wife Isabella turned against him, and Edward found himself imprisoned, technically alive but no longer free. The strange part, rumours of his death in 1327 remain contested, with whispers that he may have escaped and lived as a fugitive in Europe. Imagine the king himself skulking under a hood, sipping weak ale at an inn, and listening to peasants mock the crown he once wore. From England, your path drifts to France, where Charles the Bad, yes, that was his actual nickname, earned himself a reputation as both schemer and traitor. He switched sides between France and England during the 100 Years, war more times than you've probably switched pillows while trying to fall asleep. Wanted by his own people and distrusted by allies, Charles thrived on betrayal. One quirky tidbit. He supposedly died in a bizarre accident involving being wrapped in brandy-soaked cloth and catching fire, a king so slippery that even death had to sneak up on him in absurd fashion. Further east, you hear the faint echo of Ladislaus the Posthumous, a boy king tangled in webs of succession disputes. His crime wasn't betrayal but simply existing as a contested heir, which was enough to make factions hunt him like prey. He's less remembered than the Edwards and Charleses, but his life tells you how in the medieval world, simply being born with the wrong claim was enough to paint a target on your back. But maybe the most cinematic of all is Richard II of England, deposed in 1399. He went from commanding armies to being locked away in Pontefract Castle, where official records claim he starved to death. Yet even here, scholars debate, was it starvation, murder, or something in between? And as you listen, you realize that kingship was never safe. Once unseated, a monarch became the most wanted person of all, because no one could allow a deposed king to live freely and risk rebellion. You keep walking, lanterns swinging, shadows stretching along stone walls. Kings once worshipped like demigods now reduced to whispers, their portraits burned, their very existence erased like chalk under rain. And yet their names survive, Edward, Charles, Richard, etched not as rulers but as fugitives of history. Rebel knights, you ride alongside armoured warriors turned fugitives, once sworn to honour but now wanted men. You keep drifting deeper into the medieval dark, and suddenly the armour clinks louder than coins, because here you're not dealing with kings anymore, you're brushing shoulders with rebel knights. Once sworn to protect the very order of kingdoms, they ended up on the wrong side of loyalty, transforming into fugitives chased across fields, forests, and even churchyards. There's something almost cinematic about knights-turned outlaws, their banners torn down, their names scratched from oaths, and their swords still sharp enough to remind the crown they hadn't disappeared quietly. The first figure who edges into your path is William Wallace. Yes, the one whose legend became way more famous centuries later with a certain movie that got about half the history wrong. Wallace wasn't a king, but he was absolutely one of the most wanted men in medieval Europe. After leading Scottish resistance against English occupation, he became a symbol of rebellion, hunted across the rugged Highlands. The crown placed a hefty price on his head, and his capture in 1305 led to one of those "do not Google this before bed" executions. Yet here's a strange twist. While historians agree on his capture and death, they still argue whether Wallace was truly the main leader of Scotland's fight, or more of a rallying symbol while others did the heavy lifting. Either way, imagine being Wallace, slipping into cottages at night, keeping your voice low, while every villager you meet might either shelter you or betray you for silver. Further south, you find Bertrand du Guesclin of France, a knight whose loyalty sometimes seemed like a flexible commodity. He fought in the 100 Years' War, but here's the twist. His habit of switching allegiances between factions sometimes painted him as both hero and traitor. Even though France eventually honoured him, his mercenary beginnings made him suspect, often branded by rivals as a knight for hire rather than a knight for honor. You picture him riding under borrowed banner, visor down, half the countryside whispering whether he was their savior or their next tormentor. And then there's the tale of Ulrich von Liechtenstein, not the rom-com version you might be thinking of, but the actual knight from medieval Austria. He styled himself as a wandering champion of love, performing bizarre tournaments while disguised in costumes, sometimes even as Venus, the goddess of love. Quirky, absolutely, but while he's not usually listed on most wanted rosters for crimes, he did manage to anger powerful rivals with his antics and his challenges. At least once, he found himself hounded across territories for dueling provocations that escalated beyond chivalric games. You can almost laugh, because what's more medieval than a knight in drag causing enough chaos that nobles want him silenced? Cross over into Spain, and you'll stumble upon El Cid, Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar. Depending on who you ask, he was either the perfect knight or a dangerous rebel who played both sides in wars between Christian and Muslim rulers. Cast out by King Alfonso VI. El Cid became the most wanted knight in Castile, wandering with his loyal band of warriors and offering his sword to whoever could pay and shelter him. The quirky detail here, even after being exiled, he grew so powerful that he carved out his own domain in Valencia, essentially living the outlaw dream of turning wanted into untouchable. Historians still argue whether he was truly loyal to his faith or just loyal to his own ambitions. And hovering over all of this is the ghost of the Knights Templar. Officially, they were protectors of pilgrims and guardians of treasure. Unofficially, the moment King Philip IV of France accused them of heresy in 1307, they all became wanted men. Imagine hundreds of knights suddenly outlawed, hiding in monasteries, disguising themselves as peasants, or vanishing into ships at sea. One fringe tidbit insists that some escaped with treasure to Scotland or even farther west, which is why conspiracy theorists love to paint them as medieval fugitives whose disappearance shaped later legends. Whether true or not, they embody the idea that knights weren't always shining heroes. They could be the hunted just as easily as the hunters. So you stand there in the cool night breeze, hearing hooves echo on stone. Rebel knights ride past you, banners frayed, eyes sharp, their reputations both feared and admired. Some fight for freedom, some for coin, some for love, and some for secrets buried in vaults. But all of them share one thing, their names etched into lists of the most wanted, proof that in the medieval world, honor and outlawry were sometimes just two sides of the same dented shield. Runaway clerics, you wander cloisters where holy men break vows, chased for sins of greed, lust and treason. You wander away from the clash of swords and hooves, slipping into the dim cloisters and candlelit chapels of the medieval world. Here you expect quiet prayers, the faint scent of incense, and rows of monks chanting in calm harmony. But instead, you find whispers of scandal, fugitive clerics slipping into shadows, and holy men hunted not by the devil but by kings, bishops, and inquisitors. These are runaway clerics, men who vowed obedience to God yet found themselves on most wanted lists for greed, lust, rebellion, or heresy. The first figure who steps into the flickering light is Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury. Though he's remembered today as a martyr, rewind to before his murder in 1170, and you see him as a target of King Henry II. Once a friend of the king, Becket turned against royal attempts to control the church, defying the crown at every step. By the time Henry growled, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Becket was already the most wanted man in England, dodging exile and pressure from every side. Historians still argue whether Becket was truly principled or just politically shrewd, but you can imagine him slipping into chapels at night, clutching his robes tighter, aware that royal knights were already sharpening their blades. Then there's Jan Hus of Bohemia, a preacher who shook up the medieval church a century before Martin Luther. His fiery sermons against corruption made him the star of Prague's reform movement, but also painted a huge bullseye on his back. Summoned to the Council of Constance in 1415 under the promise of safe conduct, Hus walked straight into the trap. Declared a heretic, he was imprisoned and burned at the stake, but before that he lived the fugitive's life, hiding among sympathizers while inquisitors spread word of his crimes. The quirky tidbit: his followers, the Hussites, later fought back so fiercely that the church itself became the hunted in Bohemia, flipping the script in a rare medieval twist. Closer to home, you might bump into a rogue monk or two. Not all fugitives wore crowns or swords. Sometimes it was brother so-and-so sneaking out of a monastery with stolen relics or abandoning vows of chastity for a life of wandering. There are chronicles of abbots hunting runaway monks like lost sheep, except these sheep carried bags of gold or scandalous love letters. One fringe story even tells of a nun in Saxony who faked her death, escaped her convent, and lived decades disguised as a man. Technically, she became a wanted person by both her order and local authorities, but you can't help smirking at the audacity. Medieval Netflix would have bought the rights in a heartbeat. And then, of course, the grand stage of heresy trials looms over everything. The Cathars in southern France, labeled enemies of the faith, gave rise to entire crusades meant to hunt them down. Imagine entire villages branded heretical, priests leading armies, and fugitives scattering into mountains and caves. You pass by crumbling fortresses like Montségur, where Cathar defenders once faced a fiery end. Some accounts claim survivors escaped into the Pyrenees, carrying secret teachings, always on the run from inquisitors determined to erase them. Historians still argue whether Cathar beliefs were truly a threat to orthodoxy or just a convenient excuse for political conquest, but the result was the same. Priests hunted as criminals, sermons whispered like contraband. And here's a lighter note in the shadows. Clerics sometimes made wanted lists not for heresy but for sheer bad behavior. Some medieval bishops drank too much, gambled, or ran private militias. Few even got excommunicated themselves, dodging papal messengers as though Rome were a medieval collections agency. Picture a bishop hiding in a tavern corner while townsfolk gossip about whether the man who should be blessing them is actually wanted for unpaid debts and broken vows. So in these cloisters of half-light, you realize the medieval church wasn't always a sanctuary. For every pious monk chanting in peace, there was another cleric on the run, heretics, rebels, thieves, or martyrs to be. You breathe in the smoky air, knowing that the holy and the hunted were sometimes the same person, and their names still echo in prayers, curses, and the margins of history books. Infamous bandits, you skulk through forests alive with robbers who defy sheriffs and kings, legends sprouting in their wake. You slip away from the heavy incense of cloisters and into the tangled woods, where shadows stretch long and the only music is the rustle of leaves. Out here, the law thins out, and so do your chances of keeping your purse. These forests are alive with bandits, men and women who turned outlaw for coin, for revenge, or sometimes just because they couldn't stand another day under a lord's thumb. And in the medieval world, once the sheriff or the crown branded you as thief, you weren't just a petty criminal, you became one of the most wanted people alive. The first name echoing through the greenwood is, of course, Robin Hood. Whether he was a real outlaw, a stitched-together legend, or just a campfire story blown out of proportion, Robin remains the archetype of the wanted medieval bandit. Chroniclers argue endlessly, was he a commoner, a disgraced noble? Did he fight during the reign of King Richard or King John? Historians still argue whether Robin Hood even existed, but one quirky tidbit says early ballads describe him not as the noble hero we picture today, but more of a violent trickster who occasionally robbed poor peasants right alongside the rich. Imagine him in his rough green hood, bow drawn, but instead of Hollywood heroics, you hear him mutter curses as he counts stolen pennies in the dark. But Robin wasn't alone. Across medieval Europe, banditry was a constant thorn in the side of authorities. In Germany, tales spread of the Räuber or Robinites, nobles who decided castles made great bases for extortion. They would block trade routes, collect tolls at sword point, and hold merchants hostage until ransoms were paid. These knights became so infamous that entire armies were sometimes raised just to smoke them out of their stone nests. You picture torches flaring against castle walls, peasants cheering, and a nobleman scowling from a tower wanted posters nailed to every market square. Further south in Italy, the forests and hills bred their own legends. Marco Sira, often called the King of Bandits, roamed the late medieval countryside with a band of hundreds. Unlike Robin, Sira lived openly, challenging authorities to catch him while peasants sometimes protected him. The quirky part, he occasionally played the role of Robin Hood, handing out stolen bread to villagers, which made him popular even as he topped wanted lists. Imagine trudging through a dusty Italian road, and suddenly an armed band surrounds you, but instead of just robbing, their leader lectures you on corruption in Rome before tossing you a loaf of bread. In Spain, bandoleros haunted the rugged passes, their exploits so common that poets wove their names into verse. Some became regional heroes, others despised criminals, but all of them lived like ghosts, slipping from cave to cave, always a step ahead of sheriffs and soldiers. And if you shift eastward into the Balkans, you stumble into hayducks, brigands who blended banditry with rebellion, striking against Ottoman officials. Here, the line between criminal and freedom fighter blurred so much that ballads praise them even today, while medieval rulers marked them as fugitives. But banditry wasn't just for men. You hear rumors of robber maidens, women who led gangs or disguised themselves as men to ambush travelers. One story tells of a German noblewoman who, after being widowed, took to the forest with a band of mercenaries and began raiding caravans. Historians still debate if these tales were exaggerated moral warnings about unruly women, but they add color to the fugitive life. A cloak pulled tight, a dagger hidden in skirts, a price on one's head no smaller than any man's. And then there's the strange world of sanctuary laws. Outlaws who made it to church could claim sanctuary for up to 40 days. Imagine a thief sprinting across muddy roads, guards on his heels, bursting into a chapel just in time. For over a month he'd eat bread, sleep by the altar and weigh his choices, stand trial, flee into exile, or risk sneaking out again. Sometimes sheriffs simply waited outside, making the sanctuary little more than a slow countdown to recapture. You keep moving through the forest path, the smell of smoke in the air, your purse suddenly feeling a little too heavy. Every snapping twig makes you think a bow is trained on your back. In these woods, justice doesn't matter, only survival. And whether they were noble rebels or ruthless thieves, these bandits all carried the same title. Most wanted, hunted by kings, cursed by lords, and remembered in the uneasy ballads still hummed by weary travelers. Rogue mercenaries, you march with sellswords who swap loyalty for coin, leaving trails of betrayal and broken oaths. You step out of the damp forest paths and into the clamor of military camps, where fires burn low and the smell of sweat and steel thickens the air. Here you find a new breed of fugitive, the rogue mercenary. These men didn't pledge themselves to crowns or causes. They pledged themselves to whoever jingled the loudest purse of coins. And when their contracts ended, or worse, weren't honored, they turned loose on the countryside, transforming into some of the most dangerous, most wanted figures of the medieval world. Take the free companies of 14th century France. After the 100 Years' War saw periods of truce, thousands of soldiers suddenly had no battles to fight and no lords to pay them. Instead of going home, they banded together into roaming armies of mercenaries, extorting towns, robbing monasteries, and burning fields. They were like freelance chaos bringers, equal parts professional warriors and professional nightmares. Chroniclers describe them as locusts descending on villages, leaving nothing but ashes and debt behind. The crown placed bounties on their leaders, but hunting them was like chasing smoke. Imagine stumbling into one of their camps, ragged banners fluttering, dice clattering in the mud, and a leader grinning at you as if deciding whether to hire you or ransom you. One of the most infamous leaders was Sir John Hawkwood, an English mercenary who carved out a career in Italy. To the city-states he served, he was a master tactician. To his enemies, he was the very definition of a wanted man. The quirky detail. Florence admired him so much that after his death, they painted his portrait in their cathedral, even though decades earlier he'd terrified the countryside as a marauding condottiere. Historians still argue whether Hawkwood was a necessary evil who stabilized Italy or simply a predator who took advantage of endless wars. Shift eastward and you encounter the White Company, another band of mercenaries who painted themselves as professional soldiers but often strayed into banditry. They fought for Pisa, Milan, Florence, whoever could afford them. And when no one paid, they became the enemy of everyone. Picture a medieval mayor writing frantic letters begging a duke to fund a ransom, because otherwise the mercenaries camped outside would torch the whole town. It's not hard to see why their captains were always at the top of wanted lists. Even knights of high birth sometimes slipped into mercenary life. Taking Guérin de Coucy, a French noble who fought across Europe, switching allegiances in ways that left chroniclers scratching their heads. One month he fought for the French crown, the next for England, and later for Italian lords. His ability to flip sides so easily made him both valuable and dangerously unpredictable. Imagine your employer realizing the man you hired to protect your castle now knows every weak point in your defenses, and has just sold that knowledge to your enemy. And then there were the Almogavars of Spain, fierce Catalan mercenaries who fought in the Byzantine Empire. Their battle cry supposedly terrified enemies so much that towns surrendered at its sound. But when their employers failed to pay them, the Almogavars turned their fury on the land itself, ravaging villages and carving their own territory. For a time, they essentially ran their own rogue state in Greece, unwanted by anyone yet impossible to destroy. A quirky fringe story tells of mercenaries who, when denied payment, kidnapped the very kings or nobles who hired them. It's hard not to chuckle at the absurdity. Sorry, sire, but until the gold arrives, you're our guest in chains. These hostage stunts turned captains into both powerful negotiators and fugitives from vengeance. So as you linger by the fading campfires, you realize mercenaries lived in a liminal space, sometimes honored, often feared, always wanted by someone. Their swords could make them heroes one day and fugitives the next. And in the medieval night, when coins ran out and loyalty turned sour, even the best-trained warrior could find himself branded not as a soldier of fortune, but as one of the most wanted men alive. Heretic hunters, you drift into smoky courts where priests are condemned as heretics, fugitives in their own faith. You leave the mercenary camps behind, their dice still clattering in the mud, and follow the drifting smoke of burned villages until it curls into the sharp scent of incense again. But this isn't the calm monastery atmosphere you stumbled through earlier. This is heavier, darker. You've walked into the age of heretic hunters, where priests, scholars, and preachers found themselves branded traitors to the faith, and hunted not just by kings, but by the full force of the medieval church. In this world, being accused of heresy didn't just make you unpopular. It made you one of the most wanted people alive, with your name carried on whispered denunciations from pulpit to pulpit. One of the earliest names etched into this fugitive role is Peter Waldo, a wealthy merchant from Lyon. Around the late 12th century, he sold all he owned to preach poverty, rejecting the riches of the church. Noble idea, right? But his refusal to bow to ecclesiastical authority turned him into a heretic in the church's eyes. The Waldensians, as his followers became known, preached across Europe, dodging inquisitors, often hiding in mountains and caves. Historians still argue whether Waldo himself died peacefully or was hunted down, but either way, he lived like a man carrying a bullseye painted by Rome. Imagine him slipping into a farmhouse at night, offering a sermon by candlelight, while villagers kept an ear cocked for armored boots outside. Fast forward a century and you collide with the legend of the Cathars. These heretics flourished in southern France, preaching a dualistic world where spirit was pure and matter was corrupt. The church couldn't stomach such teachings, so it launched the Albigensian Crusade. Whole towns were put to the sword in an effort to root them out, but survivors scattered, hiding in mountain fortresses like Montségur. Quirky tidbit. Some accounts claim the last Cathar stronghold smuggled away a treasure, possibly sacred texts, before its fall. Historians still argue whether this treasure even existed, but the mere rumor makes the Cathars sound like the Indiana Jones fugitives of their age. Then of course there's John Wycliffe in England. Known as the Morning Star of the Reformation, he dared to translate the Bible into English and question papal authority. For this he was hunted, though protected at times by sympathetic nobles. Even after his death, the church wasn't satisfied. In one of history's more petty moves, officials dug up his bones decades later, burned them, and scattered the ashes. Imagine being so wanted that even your skeleton had a bounty on it. Jan Hus, whom you met earlier in Bohemia, burns back into view here because his story is central to this chapter. He was promised safe passage to the Council of Constance, only to be arrested and executed anyway. That betrayal sent shockwaves across Europe, making Hus not just wanted, but a martyr. His followers, the Hussites, proved so determined that crusades against them failed, and at times the papal armies themselves ended up fleeing like criminals. The hunter and hunted swapped roles, reminding you that in medieval Europe, power could tilt overnight. The Inquisition became the great machinery of heretic hunting. Torquemada in Spain, grim as his reputation is, represents the system at its peak. While the Spanish Inquisition technically arrives late in the medieval timeline, its roots stretch deep. Once you were accused, secrecy wrapped around you like a noose. Informants whispered your name, trials unfolded in dim chambers, and before you knew it, your portrait was hanging in public with the word heretic scrawled underneath. The open debate among historians, whether inquisitors truly believed they were saving souls or whether politics and greed played the larger role. Spoiler, probably both, and tucked within all this darkness, a little levity appears. One friar, Roger Bacon, often faced suspicion for his experiments with optics and alchemy. While not officially outlawed like Hus or Wycliffe, Bacon spent time imprisoned by his order. Some later chroniclers exaggerated, painting him as a fugitive wizard hunted by church authorities. Was he? Not really. But the fringe image of a medieval scientist running from torch-wielding monks is too vivid not to picture as you walk these halls. So the incense curls, the torches flicker, and you stand in the echo of whispered trials. Heretics weren't just criminals. They were thinkers, rebels, dreamers, and sometimes scapegoats. And whether they were burned, banished, or vanished into the hills, they all shared that chilling medieval badge, most wanted in the eyes of both heaven and earth. Pirates of rivers and seas, you sail with marauders who loot coasts and rivers, wanted by every crown yet adored by some. You leave behind the echo of tribunals and burning stakes, stepping instead onto creaking wooden planks that sway beneath your feet. Salt stings your nose, gulls screech overhead, and waves slap against the hulls of ships moored in shadow. Welcome to the world of river and sea pirates, fugitives who carried their wanted posters not just on land, but across every coastline of medieval Europe. Here, being most wanted meant that every crown from London to Constantinople cursed your name, while fishermen, merchants, and nobles prayed you never appear on the horizon. Your first encounter is with the North Sea's notorious raiders, the Victual Brothers. Originally hired as privateers to supply besieged Stockholm in the 14th century, they quickly realized piracy was far more profitable. Once the war ended, they refused to disband. Instead, they turned the Baltic into their playground, raiding Hanseatic League ships and coastal towns. Imagine them sailing under red banners, their name whispered like a curse by merchants clutching prayer beads. The quirky tidbit: they once kidnapped the Bishop of Roskilde and held him for ransom. Medieval most wanted lists rarely looked more embarrassing for the church than a bishop chained in the hold of a pirate galley. But piracy wasn't confined to northern seas. Along the English Channel, men like Eustace the monk terrorized waters in the early 13th century. Once a Benedictine monk, Eustace ditched the cloister for a career of banditry and sea raiding. Switching loyalties between England and France, he embodied the mercenary spirit of piracy. At one point, he commanded fleets that blockaded ports and ransomed entire coastal regions. Historians still argue whether Eustace was a genius strategist or simply a ruthless opportunist, but either way he was hunted across 2 kingdoms until finally captured and executed. A monk turned pirate, wanted by kings on both sides of the Channel, you can't make this up. Further south in the Mediterranean, pirates flourished like barnacles on a hull. Genoa and Venice, those powerhouse republics, hated pirates with a passion, but often winked when their own privateers bent the rules. The line between pirate and patriot blurred constantly. You can imagine a captain storming a merchant ship by day, then sitting in a Venetian tavern that same night, buying rounds with the gold he'd just stolen, authorities knowing full well who he was, but unable to touch him without sparking scandal. And then there's the Dalmatian coast, where the Uskoks made a name for themselves. Based out of Senge, these pirates preyed on Ottoman and Venetian shipping alike, creating headaches for both empires. The quirky twist, they justified their piracy as holy war, claiming they were simply harassing infidels. But Venetian merchants weren't impressed when their ships vanished under Uskok sails. Bounties piled up, yet the Uskoks melted into rocky inlets, always a storm's length ahead of their hunters. Even rivers weren't safe. On the Rhine, Robinites sometimes played pirate with passing barges. And in China, far from Europe but still very much medieval, pirates on the Yangtze and Pearl rivers forced emperors to mobilize fleets. The most wanted didn't always sail open seas. They could strike in the winding bends of inland waterways, where towns lived in fear of black-sailed boats slipping silently through the fog. But pirates weren't always hated. In some places, locals adored them for redistributing stolen wealth or for simply annoying the overlords. Fishermen secretly supplied them, townsfolk whispered warnings of patrols, and even minor lords sometimes sheltered them for a cut of the loot. Imagine sitting at a dockside tavern sipping weak ale, while a ragged sailor leans over and mutters, "The crown calls him a pirate. We call him our hero." The sea air grows colder as you walk the planks, ropes creaking overhead. Every splash in the water might be the oars of a pursuing patrol, every shadow on the horizon another fugitive galley. These pirates lived knowing that kings, bishops, and merchants all wanted them gone. Yet they kept sailing, driven by hunger, greed, or sheer defiance. And long after the waves closed over their ships, their names lingered like foam, whispered in both curses and ballads. Cursed nobles, you slip into castles where disgraced lords plot rebellion, hunted for daring to challenge kingship itself. You leave the salty tang of the sea behind and wander back into the stony echoes of castles, their high towers looming against a star-speckled sky. Inside these walls, wealth gleamed, goblets clinked, and lords plotted beneath tapestries. But some nobles, instead of playing loyal chess pieces for their kings, decided to flip the board entirely. These were the cursed nobles, dukes, counts, and princes whose ambition or betrayal made them not just rivals but fugitives, the most wanted people in the eyes of kings who once called them kin. The first shadow you pass belongs to Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, remembered as the Kingmaker. In the Wars of the Roses, his power was so vast that he could topple monarchs and install new ones like swapping crowns from a shelf. But power breeds enemies, and when his schemes spiraled, Warwick himself became the hunted. Historians still argue whether he was motivated by principle or pure ego, but either way, once the winds shifted, the Kingmaker found himself cornered. Picture him retreating into a castle hall, banners tattered, knowing that both Yorkists and Lancastrians saw him less as an ally and more as a dangerous liability who had to be eliminated. Further east in Bohemia, Wenceslaus IV, a Holy Roman Emperor in title but not in practice, fell into disgrace. He clashed with nobles and clergy alike, earning not respect but rebellion. Twice deposed, twice imprisoned, he embodied the curse of nobility gone wrong, powerful enough to be dangerous, weak enough to be a target. Imagine the emperor himself reduced to a prisoner in his own realm, his name scrawled on proclamations calling for his restraint. But one of the juiciest stories belongs to Elena Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester. Accused in the 1440s of dabbling in sorcery to predict King Henry VI's death, she was condemned as a traitor and locked away for life. Her name became a stain, whispered in taverns as the Duchess who dared meddle in prophecy. Was she truly guilty, or just convenient for political rivals? Historians still debate, but the idea of a noblewoman branded a sorceress and hunted by her own court fits perfectly into this gallery of cursed fugitives. Quirky detail. Reports say she was forced to do a humiliating public penance, barefoot with a taper in her hand before her lifelong imprisonment. One of those you can't Netflix this fast enough moments of medieval scandal. And then looming over all is the story of Thomas of Lancaster, cousin to Edward II of England. He rose in rebellion against the king, only to be captured after defeat. His execution was meant to erase him, but instead it transformed him into a folk hero. Pilgrims later visited his tomb as though he were a saint, proof that sometimes being most wanted in life turned you into most revered in death. Imagine the crown's frustration as candles flickered around the grave of the man they had branded a traitor. In France, the Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless, found himself entangled in blood feuds so tangled that assassination was his only escape. Instead, it was his doom. Slain during a parley, his faction left scrambling. His death didn't erase the curse but spread it. His heirs carried the stain of betrayal and rebellion, becoming targets themselves in the endless cycle of vengeance. Even in Scotland, you hear whispers of nobles cursed by ambition. The Black Douglases, once powerful lords, clashed so fiercely with the Stuart kings that they were declared traitors and hunted. Their castles were besieged, their lands confiscated, and their name driven into outlawry. Imagine being a Douglas, riding through Heather Hills at midnight, your clan scattered, every royal soldier ordered to bring back your head. And sometimes the curse was less about rebellion and more about suspicion. Nobles who simply had too much wealth or too many allies were branded dangerous. The very crown they served would declare them wanted, a preemptive strike against rivals who might one day rise. You catch the irony. The higher you climbed in medieval society, the more likely you were to fall, not quietly, but with your name on wanted proclamations nailed to cathedral doors. So you stand in the cold hall of a castle, tapestries swaying in the draught, portraits staring down at you with painted eyes. These nobles once feasted here, wine spilling, daggers clinking beside goblets. Now their names echo as curses, traitors, witches, rebels, branded as most wanted not because they lacked power, but because they had too much. And in the medieval Game of Thrones, that alone was enough to doom you. Spies and assassins, you shadow figures who stab in silence, carrying secret orders that make them the most wanted of all. You slip away from the ruined halls of disgraced nobles and find yourself in narrow alleyways, cloaked in shadow, where the real whispers of fear circulate. Not about armies or crowns this time, but about individuals who moved unseen, spies and assassins, the invisible hands that shaped kingdoms while leaving no fingerprints behind. If kings were wanted for treason and nobles for ambition, these figures were most wanted for simply existing. You never saw them until it was too late. The air here smells of damp stone and candle wax, the kind of place where secrets are bought and sold. You tread carefully, because spies were the currency of medieval survival. Take John Hawkwood, for example. He's remembered as a mercenary captain in Italy. But his intelligence network stretched across borders. Some say he sold secrets to Florence, then Milan, then even the papacy, always one step ahead, never loyal to more than his purse. Historians still argue whether he was a patriot or just the medieval version of a double agent. Either way, when rival states posted most wanted lists, his name must have been etched near the top. But espionage wasn't just men in smoky taverns. Consider the women who gathered whispers. Elena of Aquitaine, powerful queen of both France and England, was suspected of encouraging assassination plots and passing secrets during the bitter Angevin conflicts. Was she truly orchestrating betrayals, or was her sharp wit enough to make paranoid kings brand her guilty? We'll never know, but she was feared enough to be locked away for years by her own husband. Then there are the assassins who took whispers and turned them into action. Think of the legendary Hashishin of the Middle East. Yes, that's where our word assassin comes from. Their reputation was so terrifying that European lords would nervously glance over their shoulders at banquets, imagining a dagger sliding silently between their ribs. Quirky tidbit. Some chroniclers claim these assassins used honeycakes laced with opiates to lull recruits into visions of paradise, convincing them their deadly missions were holy. Whether true or not, the mystique alone made them wanted men across Christendom. Closer to home in England, Roger Mortimer plotted in secret with Queen Isabella to overthrow Edward II. Their conspiracy relied on coded messages, bribes, and silent blades in the dark. For a while, Mortimer was untouchable, ruling as though he were king. But when the tide turned, he found himself branded a traitor, dragged to execution, and remembered as one of the most wanted manipulators of his age. And don't forget the papal spies, those quiet clerks in Rome who leaked royal plans from confessionals and candlelit scriptoria. Information was as deadly as any sword, and the Vatican's ability to eavesdrop turned priests into both trusted confessors and dangerous informants. You never quite knew if that soft-spoken monk was praying for your soul or reporting your words to Rome. Meanwhile, Italy produced the infamous condottieri spies, men like Francesco Busson, who shifted sides mid-battle, selling strategies to the highest bidder. Picture him handing a sealed parchment to a rival commander, then watching as his former employer's army walked into a trap. Was he clever or cowardly? Historians still debate, but the wanted posters that followed his treacheries spoke louder than any argument. Assassins weren't always exotic or hired blades. Sometimes they were close to home, kitchen servants, guards, even lovers who smuggled poison into a goblet. Picture the Duke of Orleans in 1407, ambushed and butchered on a Paris street, likely at the order of John the Fearless. That killing sent ripples through France, turning an ordinary power struggle into civil war. Spies and assassins had that power. They didn't just kill people, they killed stability itself. You glance up at a torch flickering on the wall, shadows dancing like figures with hidden daggers. Imagine living in a world where one misstep, one overheard whisper, could put your name on a list of the most wanted. The kings and nobles had castles to hide in. The assassins and spies only had their anonymity. And once that veil was torn away, they were hunted like foxes through the night. You step back into the street, heartbeat steady but a little faster, half expecting a cloaked figure to trail you. Because in this corner of medieval history, being most wanted wasn't about armies or rebellions. It was about shadows, silence, and the sharp glint of a blade in the dark. The vanished and never found, you follow whispers of fugitives who escaped justice, vanishing into rumor, legend, or thin air. The alley's thin, and the air softens as you follow whispers into the forgotten corners of the medieval world, where fugitives didn't just hide, they vanished entirely. These are the vanished and never found, those whose names linger in rumor, their fates a riddle. You move through empty markets, past abandoned keeps, and sense the presence of those who escaped both justice and history, leaving only traces of legend behind. Take the case of King Edward II, whose rumored escape after imprisonment continues to tantalize historians. Some accounts suggest he was smuggled across Europe, disguised as a commoner, and lived out his days quietly, a king without a throne. Was it wishful thinking, political propaganda, or truth? Historians still argue whether Edward truly survived or if it was simply hope's persistence among loyalists. Quirky tidbit. A 14th century chronicle describes a man claiming to be Edward appearing in a French village, convincing locals he had royal blood and commanding respect, even offering to bless crops for gold. Whether real or fabricated, the story fueled decades of speculation. Further north, the mystery of the princes in the tower grips you. Edward V and his brother Richard vanished after their uncle Richard III seized the throne. Some say they were murdered, others whisper they escaped under the care of loyal attendants. Their disappearance has spawned novels, ballads, and countless debates. The chilling part, their names still echo in history as missing heirs, proof that vanishing could be as deadly and famous as capture. Elsewhere you hear of the Cathars who slipped away before Montségur fell. Entire families and groups allegedly escaped to hidden valleys, carrying sacred texts and secret knowledge. Some crossed mountains into Spain, others possibly reached Mediterranean ports. Historians still argue whether any truly survived in long-term exile, or if these stories are embellished to preserve hope. But imagine the tension. You're fleeing inquisitors, guiding children through snow and rock, your entire belief system depending on the success of your escape. Pirates too mastered the art of vanishing. The Vittel brothers and Uscocks occasionally disappeared into fog, rivers, and secret coves, leaving pursuers cursing the waves. One quirky legend claims a pirate captain of the North Sea lived his final years disguised as a fisherman, quietly mending nets while his former enemies paid bounties for a head already long gone. Such disappearances blurred reality, with folklore turning fugitives into almost mythical figures. Some nobles vanished in exile. John of Gaunt's distant relatives, after rebellions failed, reportedly fled into remote castles or foreign courts, their titles stripped but their stories living on. Historians still debate whether they maintained secret influence abroad or were erased entirely from power, but local legends kept their memory alive in whispered cautionary tales. Even assassins sometimes disappeared so completely that they became ghosts of their own crimes. The Hashishin, after centuries of terror, vanished from the historical record in the lands they once dominated, leaving only fear, tales, and the etymology of their name behind. And in tiny towns, local legends persist of runaway clerics, wandering mercenaries, or clever bandits who simply vanished into mountains or forests, sometimes reappearing decades later under new names. Quirky tidbit. In one French village, a man claiming to be a fugitive monk returned to bake bread for the town, quietly living out his days, unrecognized by any official authority. As you walk these empty streets, the air smells faintly of smoke and earth. You realize that being most wanted didn't always mean capture, chains, or death. Sometimes it meant slipping through the cracks of history, leaving whispers, rumors, and legends in your wake. You feel the tension of pursued footsteps fade, replaced by the quiet mystery of vanished lives that keep their secrets in the folds of time. You trudge through the dew-soaked leaves, each footstep muffled by centuries of rotting foliage, and catch the first glimpses of your fellow hunters. Squires adjusting leather jerkins, the king's falconer adjusting a glove, hounds yipping impatiently. Historians still argue whether early morning hunts were meant primarily for sustenance or spectacle, but as you glance at the gilded horns slung over shoulders and the embroidered tunics shimmering faintly in sunlight, you can guess which answer carried more weight. In your hand, a wooden bow feels awkwardly smooth, and you notice that even the royal falcons seem to carry the smug superiority of aristocracy. They know their position, perched elegantly on gloved wrists, watching, always watching. Every forest has its own scent, its own soundscape. The rustle of leaves might mask a deer or a boar, but it also hides mundane mischief. Squirrels performing daring leaps that would make the royal court laugh, perhaps even nervously, if anyone dared mention it. You remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? Well, some courtiers actually believed certain smelly balms would attract game rather than repel it, a fringe idea among the more superstitious hunting manuals. The hounds, unfazed by superstition, bark and strain, tails stiff, noses twitching, eager for the chase. Ahead, the king's retinue forms a semicircle, signaling readiness. The etiquette is precise. No forward step until commanded, no stray cry, and for you, a mere visitor in this ritual, the pressure is almost absurd. Yet within these early moments of waiting, the hunt is already teaching its first lesson: patience, hierarchy, and an almost ceremonial reverence for the wild. Even the smallest squirrel scuttling across a branch could be considered a portent, and you begin to understand why historians still argue whether these hunts were about actual hunting or an elaborate display of control over nature and man alike. The light shifts as dawn inches higher. Dew drips from oak leaves onto the darkened soil, creating a gentle rhythm that could almost be soothing if not for the anticipatory energy humming through the group. Squires whisper instructions, some falter in their bowstrings, and the falconer mutters to his bird, a secret conversation that humans are not privy to but which governs every wingbeat to come. You realize the forest is alive in ways you can't measure. A snapping twig signals more than movement. It's a cue in a choreography older than the castle walls, older even than the laws that protect these woods. Every rustle is a potential story, every shadow a lesson in humility and attentiveness. Off to your right, a huntsman carries a horn shaped like a stag's antler, engraved and polished until it gleams. Blowing it signals progress, setbacks, or victory, but the sound carries more than information. It resonates through the trees, through the animal's perception, and through the courtier's nerves. You notice that some of these horns are outrageously decorated, featuring jewels, gold leaf, and carvings so intricate that they seem almost ceremonial. Fringe historians have suggested that some were used less for communication than for showing off wealth, a distraction to rival the brilliance of the forest itself. You raise your eyebrows but keep silent. Etiquette demands it after all. Even now, the forest feels like a living cathedral, the hunt a sacred liturgy where every participant knows their place. You walk past the first line of hounds, their eyes sharp, their teeth occasionally glinting as they yip with excitement. You probably won't be allowed to touch them, and for good reason. A startled hound is unpredictable, like a small furry cannonball. You remember seeing tapestries where kings are depicted with enormous packs of hounds, everyone perfectly trained, yet somehow alive with its own personality, a chaotic yet disciplined orchestra of fur and instinct. As your fingers brush a fern, you notice the subtle hum of life all around. Birds flitting from branch to branch, insects buzzing, and in the distance, the faint sound of water trickling through moss-covered rocks. This is the backdrop against which centuries of royal drama played out, every hunter stage, every hunter a reluctant actor. The king steps forward, signaling with a simple gesture, and the forest seems to exhale collectively. You trudge along in the shadows of the royal party, the crunch of leaves underfoot punctuating the careful cadence. You wonder, as historians still debate, whether the ordinary hunters felt awe or annoyance at such a display. Was it a unifying moment or a stark reminder of social strata? Either way, the scene unfolds like a slow-motion pageant, the sun glinting on chainmail, the scent of damp earth, and the quiet anticipation of a chase that will soon begin in earnest. Time stretches, soft and patient, as you walk deeper into the forest. Every detail matters, the slight tilt of a head, the way a squire adjusts a glove, even the rhythm of the hound's breathing. The hunt is not yet violent, it is almost meditative, a lesson in observation. You notice small touches that make the scene human. A falconer whispering encouragement, a squire tripping over a root and catching himself with an embarrassed grin, and the king, oddly vulnerable in his own ceremonial armor, scanning the horizon with a practiced eye. This is the lull before motion, the quiet heartbeat before the pulse of the hunt erupts. Even now, the forest itself seems to conspire with the royal party. Moss carpets, stones, and muted greens, shadows stretch lazily across the paths, and every rustle, chirp, or whisper adds texture to the anticipation. You realize the hunt is more than chasing beasts. It's a symphony of control, ritual, and subtle communication. And as you trudge onward, feeling the weight of both your curiosity and the damp earth underfoot, you sense the first invisible threads of excitement weaving through the party. By the time the first horn blows, you'll already be deep into a world where history, theater, and nature collide in ways both thrilling and oddly intimate. Royal preparations unfold. You witness the meticulous arrangements, tents, feasts, and imported Persian treasures, as servants scramble to impress a king who never sleeps. The palace grounds stretch out before you like a living tapestry of extravagance. Tents embroidered with gold thread shimmer in the late afternoon sun, their shadows stretching lazily across the marble walkways. Servants hurry past, carrying trays of wine, platters of roasted lamb, and baskets overflowing with fruits that seem impossibly vibrant, pomegranates like tiny suns, grapes like clusters of polished amethysts. You notice one particularly harried servant juggling 3 trays at once, muttering prayers under his breath, and occasionally glancing at the sky, as if fearing a divine mishap. Historians still argue whether the Persian-style tent arrangements were meant for practical comfort or purely theatrical effect, but from where you stand, they are as dazzling as a festival in the clouds. The scent of saffron and burning oils wafts over the grounds, mingling with the faint tang of sweat from soldiers marching back and forth. You trudge along the cobblestones, dodging a cart loaded with silk rolls so fine they seem almost alive. There's a peculiar energy in the air, like the city itself is holding its breath in anticipation. Macedonian officers are scurrying around, polishing armor, straightening cloaks, and practicing polite smiles for their soon-to-be Persian brides. Some nervously twirl the hilts of their swords, others peek behind curtains to spy on the arrivals. You overhear a whisper about a Greek cook who tried to blend olive oil and rosewater into the wine. Results were questionable, but the effort was charming. Near the ceremonial stage, carpenters hammer last-minute adjustments into place. Golden columns gleam like the sun had decided to grow roots in Susa, and the marble floor sparkles under a thin layer of polished water. Servants sweep constantly, and the occasional Persian musician tunes a lyre, producing delicate notes that float like silk ribbons through the air. You can almost feel the tension between Macedonian precision and Persian grandeur pressing together like two tectonic plates. Scholars debate whether Alexander's obsession with aesthetics was political theatre or genuine admiration for Persian culture, and you find yourself silently siding with the latter, though perhaps with a sprinkle of theatre. You wander past the stables, where horses paw the ground and snort, restless at the constant noise. One officer is trying to calm a particularly spirited steed with half a loaf of bread and a lot of gritted teeth. A fringe tale mentions that a Macedonian noble attempted to gift his bride a small, caged eagle that promptly escaped, leaving a trail of feathers and scandal. You chuckle quietly to yourself. Some things never change, even in the grand sweep of history. As sunset paints the sky in crimson and violet, lanterns flicker to life, casting long, dancing shadows over the courtyard. You notice women in Persian robes gliding past, their delicate laughter like bells ringing softly against the hum of soldiers' boots. You catch a whiff of jasmine and frankincense, feel the smooth texture of marble under your fingers as you lean against a column, and realize that every detail, no matter how small, has been designed to awe and intimidate. You step back, take a slow breath, and watch the city prepare itself for an event so audacious that even now, centuries later, historians argue over why Alexander risked so much for appearances. Macedonian nobles gather, you mingle with nervously expectant Macedonian officers, each polishing armor and anxiously debating which Persian bride might suit them. You find yourself moving among the Macedonian nobles, each one a bundle of nerves beneath polished armor and starched tunics. They shuffle past, adjusting their cloaks, brushing imaginary dust from gleaming boots, and whispering nervously to one another about who might receive which Persian bride. Some glance at the elaborate tents, some at the fountains sparkling in the dying sunlight, and a few simply stare at the sky, as if hopping divine intervention might simplify the complicated logistics of love and politics. Historians still argue whether these officers truly embraced Alexander's vision of integration, or whether they quietly despised it. And from the jittery looks you see, it seems a little of both is likely. You sidle past a group debating the merits of silk versus linen, noticing that even their sword hilts are being compared like jewelry. One officer mutters about his fear that his bride may have been practicing Persian embroidery since birth and will look at his crude, Greek stitching with contempt. Another whispers of a rumor that one Macedonian had considered bribing the palace steward to accidentally swap brides, a plan so audacious that even Alexander might have raised an eyebrow. You stifle a chuckle. History often forgets these tiny human panics, the whispered rivalries, the awkward moments behind the grandeur, but you can feel them bubbling under the surface like mischievous little springs ready to pop. The air is scented with a mixture of dust, cooking fires, and the faint perfume of the Persian arrivals. You spot a Macedonian officer nervously practicing polite nods, trying to memorize the names of women he's about to wed, each name foreign and musical, rolling off his tongue with awkward clumsiness. A fringe tale tells of one man who accidentally called his bride by the name of a horse he owned, resulting in polite laughter that echoed across the courtyard. You lean against a marble column, feeling the warm stone beneath your fingertips, imagining the absurdity of these highly disciplined warriors fumbling through the etiquette of an alien culture. Around the ceremonial stage, carpenters and tent tenders scurry, ensuring that every golden detail is aligned with perfection. Macedonians, with their rigid sense of order, find themselves outmatched by the Persian flair for opulence, yet they adapt with nervous determination. Some are calculating political alliances, others are nervously adjusting veils and cufflinks. You overhear a whispered debate about whether a certain Persian noble's lineage might make him a better ally than the bride she brought. Historians still argue whether the officers truly cared about politics or were just anxious about personal appearances. As twilight descends, shadows stretch long across the courtyard, and lanterns begin to twinkle like stars brought low to the earth. The nervous tension, the smells of exotic spices, and the faint laughter of women practicing their ceremonial steps all converge into a dizzying, intoxicating atmosphere. You realize that this moment, seemingly small, is a microcosm of the larger experiment Alexander is attempting, blending cultures, forging alliances, and testing human patience all at once. Every glance, every whispered instruction, every awkward bow and forced smile carries the weight of history. You take a slow breath, letting the scent of rosewater and sandalwood fill your senses, and prepare yourself for the inevitable collision of Macedonian rigor and Persian splendor that is about to unfold. Persian elite and cultural clash. You sense tension as Persian nobles arrive, their silk robes and perfumed presence contrasting sharply with the rugged Macedonians. You sense the tension rising as the Persian elite begin arriving, their entrance a parade of silk, gold, and confidence. The courtyard seems to hold its breath as flowing robes brush against marble, jeweled necklaces catch the fading sunlight, and delicate slippers tap with quiet authority. Macedonian soldiers, sturdy and straightforward, stand awkwardly, unsure whether to bow, smile, or simply stay out of the way. Historians still argue whether Alexander's insistence on Persian participation was an effort at genuine cultural integration or an elaborate display of dominance, and watching these interactions, you start to suspect it's a little of both. You walk among the Persian dignitaries, noting their calm elegance compared to the high-strung Macedonians. Some exchange polite nods, while others whisper secrets behind fans or gesture with delicate, precise movements that hint at centuries of courtly training. You notice a young Persian noblewoman laughing softly, a sound like bells over running water, as she eyes a Macedonian officer attempting, and failing, to braid his own hair in imitation of Persian style. The mental image is so absurd you almost chuckle out loud, but a stray glance from a nearby guard reminds you that etiquette here is deadly serious. In the palace gardens, fountains spill water over carved stone lions, and the scent of jasmine and roses is overpowering in the warm evening air. You catch snippets of conversation, discussions of family lineage, whispered debates over which Macedonian might prove a reliable ally, and occasional sharp remarks about hairdos that don't conform to Persian standards. A fringe tale tells of a Persian noble who brought a pet monkey to the ceremonies, which caused a minor uproar when it stole a ceremonial veil and refused to return it until bribed with dates. You pause, letting the absurdity mingle with the grandeur, a reminder that even in meticulously orchestrated spectacles, chaos finds its way. You notice the cultural clash in subtle gestures, the Macedonians' straight posture against the Persian ponchon for flowing movement, their clipped voices against soft, lilting tones, their crude olive oil-scented cologne against the faint perfume of roses and spices. Historians still argue whether Alexander's goal was diplomatic or theatrical, and watching a Macedonian officer nervously attempt to bow while a Persian nobleman glides past, you understand the challenge firsthand, navigating personal pride, political alliances, and centuries of cultural expectation all at once. As twilight deepens, lanterns flare and shadows lengthen. You can almost feel the hum of anticipation, the delicate friction of two worlds brushing against each other, each trying to maintain dignity while adapting to unfamiliar norms. You catch the scent of roasted meats mingling with sandalwood, hear soft Persian music blending with Macedonian drums, and see officers and nobles alike struggling to appear graceful while secretly panicking. This is the delicate dance of diplomacy, courtly life, and human absurdity all rolled into one, and as you lean against a fountain edge, dipping your fingers in cool water, you can't help but marvel at Alexander's audacity. He has brought together two completely different worlds and somehow expects them to dance in unison. Alexander's own marriage. You hover near Alexander as he weds Statira and Parasates simultaneously, pondering the political theatre behind his personal choices. You hover near Alexander as the atmosphere thickens with expectation. He moves with that effortless confidence, a figure carved in sunlight and authority, draped in rich fabrics that ripple with each step. His eyes scan the courtyard, calculating, charming, intimidating all at once, and you can almost feel the magnetic pull he exerts on everyone around him. Statira and Parasates await, poised and regal, their elegance both a comfort and a subtle challenge to the Macedonian officers scattered around the palace grounds. Historians still argue whether Alexander's dual marriage was a sincere attempt to unite two royal lines or a spectacle meant solely for political theatre, but watching him now, it feels like both. Strategy wrapped in romance or romance wrapped in strategy, it's hard to untangle. The ceremony begins quietly, almost deceptively, with whispered instructions from priests and attendants. You catch a flash of embroidered sleeves, a glint of jewelry, and the faint scent of rosewater that seems to hang heavier around Alexander's brides. The king's demeanor is calm, yet you notice a tiny twitch in his hand as he reaches for Statira's, a subtle sign of human anxiety beneath monumental resolve. A fringe tale whispers that Alexander once attempted to choreograph the movement of every hand, every glance, so that the symbolic gestures aligned perfectly with Persian and Macedonian customs. The result, they say, was an awkward pause when a noble misstepped and had to be subtly guided back into position, a moment that could have unraveled the delicate equilibrium of the entire court. You trudge closer, catching snippets of conversation from officers and attendants alike. Some are marveling at Alexander's poise, others at the grandeur of the Persian fabrics, and a few are quietly fretting over what these marriages will mean for their own political ambitions. Macedonian officers shift uncomfortably in their boots, realizing that their personal anxieties are now part of the spectacle itself. You can hear a murmur about a nobleman who practiced bows for hours, only to trip on the marble floor during the actual ceremony, an embarrassing, yet oddly humanizing moment preserved in fringe accounts. As the ritual progresses, the symbolism of Alexander's actions becomes clearer. He touches each bride with a deliberate gentleness, signaling respect for Persian tradition, while asserting his authority as Macedonian king. Priests chant softly, blending Greek and Persian ritual phrases, their voices weaving a strange, hypnotic rhythm through the courtyard. You notice subtle glances exchanged between statera and parasatis, acknowledgement, caution, perhaps even amusement at the absurdity of the spectacle. Historians still argue whether the brides were genuinely willing participants, or if their compliance was purely performative, and watching the scene unfold, you can almost see the negotiation happening behind those serene expressions. By the time Alexander and his brides complete the ceremonial gestures, the courtyard is alive with soft murmurs, polite applause, and the occasional restrained laugh. You feel a mixture of awe and slight vertigo, as if standing on a precipice where politics, culture, and human emotion converge into one intricate dance. You inhale deeply, tasting the mingled fragrances of incense, perfumes, and freshly baked bread, and realize that this is more than a wedding. It's a masterstroke of symbolism, human folly, and calculated audacity. As you step back, adjusting your own tunic and brushing off imaginary dust, you can't help but marvel. Alexander has not only wed two royal women, he has orchestrated a spectacle that will echo across time, a mixture of ambition, spectacle, and human absurdity that historians will argue over for centuries. The mass ceremony begins. You are swept into the spectacle as dozens of Macedonian officers marry Persian women in orchestrated rituals that blend East and West. You are swept into the mass ceremony itself, the sheer scale of it staggering your senses. Dozens of Macedonian officers stand in neat rows, each nervously adjusting tunics, checking cuffs, and stealing glances at the Persian brides approaching with their measured, graceful steps. The air hums with anticipation, punctuated by the soft clinking of jewelry and the occasional sharp hiss of a reprimanded soldier. Historians still argue whether these mass marriages were meant primarily as a political statement or as a genuine effort at cross-cultural unity, but from where you stand, it feels both absurdly theatrical and precariously intimate. You trudge along the ceremonial area, catching snippets of whispered instructions. Priests in flowing robes instruct the couples on ritual gestures, some mimicking Persian customs, others adhering to Macedonian conventions. The brides glide forward, their delicate feet barely making a sound on the polished marble, while the officers shift awkwardly, trying to match their calm, almost ethereal elegance. A fringe tale mentions a Macedonian who reportedly tried to impress his bride by dramatically tossing a ceremonial cup, but it shattered on the marble floor, sending shards scattering like tiny suns and eliciting polite, restrained laughter. Fountains in the courtyard bubble with crystal-clear water, reflecting lanterns and banners in flickering, fragmented images. You notice subtle gestures, the bow of a hand, a tilt of a head, carefully orchestrated yet tinged with genuine human hesitation. Some Macedonians glance at one another nervously, realizing that each movement is being watched, recorded in the memory of everyone present. Persian nobles smile faintly, their expressions a delicate mix of amusement, approval, and perhaps concealed judgment. Historians still argue whether the Macedonians' awkwardness was accidental or subtly encouraged to emphasize the king's control over both cultures, and witnessing it firsthand, you feel a little dizzy from the layers of meaning pressing down on every gesture. You lean against a marble column, letting the mingled scents of incense, rosewater, and spiced meats wash over you. Music drifts softly from musicians tucked near the fountains, lyres, flutes, and drums creating a rhythm that blends Greek precision with Persian fluidity. Officers attempt to follow the ceremonial steps, sometimes in perfect synchrony, sometimes tripping over their own inexperience. You can't help but notice the occasional wink exchanged between bride and groom, tiny human flashes that hint at personal curiosity, amusement, or relief that they survived the awkward choreography. By the time the mass marriages draw to close, the courtyard is alive with a soft murmur of conversation, the rustle of silk, and restrained laughter. You realize that this spectacle is as much about demonstrating unity and obedience as it is about genuine connection. Macedonian officers now appear slightly more confident, brides gracefully curtsy, and the mingling of two cultures, awkward, delicate, and spectacular, has created an atmosphere both awe-inspiring and slightly surreal. As you step back, brushing your fingers along cool marble edges and inhaling the mixture of aromas, you sense the enormity of what you've witnessed. A fusion of cultures, politics, and human quirks in a display so meticulously orchestrated that its memory will linger long after the lanterns flicker out. Festivities, feasts, and follies. You taste exotic dishes, hear toasts in multiple languages, and notice the awkward, almost comical mingling of two very different cultures. The festivities spill outward from the ceremonial courtyard, sweeping you into a swirl of colors, sounds, and smells. Tables groan under the weight of roasted meats, dates, figs, and golden breads, while pitchers of wine and honeyed drinks glint in the lantern light. You trudge past servants balancing platters, so precariously it's a minor miracle no one trips and ends up redecorating the marble floors with food. Macedonian officers attempt to navigate the exotic delicacies, some with gleeful curiosity, others with suspicious noses wrinkled at unfamiliar spices. Historians still argue whether Alexander intended the feast as genuine celebration or subtle training in cultural diplomacy, and frankly it feels like both, a banquet and a carefully staged lesson in tolerance. You notice the awkward mingling of languages, Greek, Persian, and a few other tongues, flowing in an almost musical cacophony. One officer accidentally toasts the wrong bride and hastily tries to recover, producing stifled laughter that echoes across the courtyard. A fringe tale tells of a Persian noble who smuggled a small dog into the feast, which promptly stole a plate of dates and caused a minor chase, leaving guests giggling and exasperated in equal measure. You lean against a fountain edge, listening to the blend of laughter, clinking goblets, and low music, and feel that rare combination of chaos and harmony that only great feasts seem to conjure. Music swells, blending Greek rhythms with Persian melodies, and you feel the subtle tug of two worlds trying to synchronize. Dancers twirl in flowing robes, their movements precise yet effortless, while Macedonians attempt to mimic with varying success. You catch the scent of rosewater on one bride's sleeve, and the faint tang of olive oil from an officer's hair, a reminder of the cultural collision unfolding in real time. Historians still debate whether Alexander's intention was to teach Macedonians Persian manners, or merely to entertain himself with the absurdity of their struggles, and watching these careful, awkward movements, you begin to see that it might have been a little of both. Behind the tables, conversations teem with gossip, political maneuvering, and personal anxieties. Officers whisper about who married whom, who might gain favor, and who appears most intimidated. Persian nobles trade subtle glances, conveying judgments that are invisible to all but the most attentive eyes. You notice an officer trying to impress a bride by juggling dates, an audacious move that earns both amusement and a subtle side-eye from the court. You realize that for every grand gesture, there is an equally small human quirk: fear, humor, curiosity, or bravado quietly threading through the pageantry. By the time twilight deepens into night, lanterns cast a soft golden glow across the courtyard, reflecting in the water of the fountains. You taste spiced wine and almonds, hear the soft laughter of women practicing polite conversation, and see the occasional mischievous grin exchanged between a nervous Macedonian and a composed Persian. The blending of cultures continues in small, almost invisible ways: songs, gestures, culinary experiments, and the gentle acceptance of absurdity. You trudge back, brushing your fingers along smooth marble and inhaling the mingled aromas of incense, roasted meats, and the faint sweetness of exotic fruits, aware that this feast, like the weddings themselves, is as much about spectacle as it is about human connection. Personal reactions and rivalries, you overhear whispered complaints, jealous glances, and the subtle political jockeying that will ripple through Alexander's court for months. You drift toward the quieter corners of the courtyard, noticing the subtle undercurrents of personal reactions and rivalries. Officers whisper behind columns, some trading complaints about their assigned brides, others quietly plotting how to use these marriages to advance their own standing. You catch snippets of conversation: a noble grumbling about the scent of jasmine that clings too persistently to his bride's gown, another muttering that a Persian maid has more charm than sense, and a third attempting to console himself with wine after an awkward beau. Historians still argue whether these whispered tensions had significant long-term political effects or were merely fleeting personal frustrations, but you can feel the charged energy radiating from each small group. You notice glances exchanged across tables, subtle nods that signal alliances, and tiny competitive gestures. A fringe tale recounts a Macedonian officer so nervous about appearing composed that he practiced smiles in a reflective pool for hours, only to spill wine on his tunic minutes before meeting his bride. You stifle a laugh, realizing that even in the midst of political theater, human anxiety refuses to be scripted. You follow a young couple weaving through the crowd, their hesitant handholds betraying both curiosity and fear, reminding you that behind every grand spectacle are countless personal stories quietly unfolding. The The courtyard's music continues, soft and hypnotic, blending Persian flutes with Greek lyres, creating an almost surreal backdrop to the personal dramas unfolding around you. Officers whisper advice, offer quiet reassurance, or engage in friendly mockery, and you notice the Persian brides exchanging subtle gestures of camaraderie and bemusement. Historians still debate whether the Macedonians genuinely sought integration or were mostly performing compliance, and watching them fumble through polite gestures and conversation, you realize it's probably a messy mix of both. You pause near a fountain, dipping a fingertip in the cool water, and watch as two rival officers accidentally collide while attempting to bow simultaneously. There is a brief flash of embarrassment, followed by muted laughter, a tiny human moment that persists even amid the grandeur of Alexander's plan. You catch the faint scent of rosewater and roasted meats blending with the crisp evening air, and it strikes you that the small, awkward, and sometimes absurd personal interactions are as integral to the event as the orchestrated ceremony itself. As night settles over Susa, lanterns flicker gently, shadows lengthen, and a sense of quiet reflection descends. You hear soft Persian lullabies mixed with Greek drinking songs, notice the discreet smiles of those who have survived the day's stress, and see officers and brides alike adjusting to one another's presence with careful grace. The personal reactions, the whispered rivalries, and the subtle political jockeying all contribute to a delicate web that Alexander has spun around the court. You step back, brushing your fingers along cool marble and inhaling deeply, aware that this quiet human drama is as consequential as any grand strategy in history. Dawn in the royal forests. You wake with the dawn among towering oaks and hear the stirrings of hounds, lords, and servants preparing for a hunt that tests both skill and status. You trudge through the dew-soaked leaves, each footstep muffled by centuries of rotting foliage, and catch the first glimpses of your fellow hunters. Squires adjusting leather jerkins, the king's falconer adjusting a glove, hounds yipping impatiently. Historians still argue whether early morning hunts were meant primarily for sustenance or spectacle, but as you glance at the gilded horns slung over shoulders and the embroidered tunics shimmering faintly in sunlight, you can guess which answer carried more weight. In your hand, a wooden bow feels awkwardly smooth, and you notice that even the royal falcons seem to carry the smug superiority of aristocracy. They know their position, perched elegantly on gloved wrists, watching, always watching. Every forest has its own scent, its own soundscape. The rustle of leaves might mask a deer or a boar, but it also hides mundane mischief. Squirrels performing daring leaps that would make the royal court laugh, perhaps even nervously if anyone dared mention it. You remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? Well, some courtiers actually believed certain smelly balms would attract game rather than repel it, a fringe idea among the more superstitious hunting manuals. The hounds, unfazed by superstition, bark and strain, tails stiff, noses twitching, eager for the chase. Ahead, the king's retinue forms a semicircle signaling readiness. The etiquette is precise. No forward step until commanded, no stray cry, and for you, a mere visitor in this ritual, the pressure is almost absurd. Yet within these early moments of waiting, the hunt is already teaching its first lesson: patience, hierarchy, and an almost ceremonial reverence for the wild. Even the smallest squirrel scuttling across a branch could be considered a portent, and you begin to understand why historians still argue whether these hunts were about actual hunting or an elaborate display of control over nature and man alike. The light shifts as dawn inches higher. Dew drips from oak leaves onto the darkened soil, creating a gentle rhythm that could almost be soothing if not for the anticipatory energy humming through the group. Squires whisper instructions, some falter in their bowstrings, and the falconer mutters to his bird, a secret conversation that humans are not privy to, but which governs every wingbeat to come. You realize the forest is alive in ways you can't measure. A snapping twig signals more than movement. It's a cue in a choreography older than the castle walls, older even than the laws that protect these woods. Every rustle is a potential story. Every shadow a lesson in humility and attentiveness. Off to your right, a huntsman carries a horn shaped like a stag's antler, engraved and polished until it gleams. Blowing, it signals progress, setbacks, or victory, but the sound carries more than information. It resonates through the trees, through the animal's perception, and through the courtier's nerves. You notice that some of these horns are outrageously decorated, featuring jewels, gold leaf, and carvings so intricate that they seem almost ceremonial. Fringe historians have suggested that some were used less for communication than for showing off wealth, a distraction to rival the brilliance of the forest itself. You raise your eyebrows but keep silent. Etiquette demands it after all. Even now, the forest feels like a living cathedral, the hunt a sacred liturgy where every participant knows their place. You walk past the first line of hounds, their eyes sharp, their teeth occasionally glinting as they yip with excitement. You probably won't be allowed to touch them, and for good reason. A startled hound is unpredictable, like a small furry cannonball. You remember seeing tapestries where kings are depicted with enormous packs of hounds, everyone perfectly trained, yet somehow alive with its own personality, a chaotic yet disciplined orchestra of fur and instinct. As your fingers brush a fern, you notice the subtle hum of life all around, birds flitting from branch to branch, insects buzzing, and in the distance, the faint sound of water trickling through moss-covered rocks. This is the backdrop against which centuries of royal drama played out, every hunt a stage, every hunter a reluctant actor. The king steps forward, signaling with a simple gesture, and the forest seems to exhale collectively. You trudge along in the shadows of the royal party, the crunch of leaves underfoot punctuating the careful cadence. You wonder, as historians still debate, whether the ordinary hunters felt awe or annoyance at such a display. Was it a unifying moment or a stark reminder of social strata? Either way, the scene unfolds like a slow-motion pageant, the sun glinting on chainmail, the scent of damp earth, and the quiet anticipation of a chase that will soon begin in earnest. Time stretches, soft and patient, as you walk deeper into the forest. Every detail matters, the slight tilt of a head, the way a squire adjusts a glove, even the rhythm of the hound's breathing. The hunt is not yet violent, it is almost meditative, a lesson in observation. You notice small touches that make the scene human. A falconer whispering encouragement, a squire tripping over a root and catching himself with an embarrassed grin, and the king, oddly vulnerable in his own ceremonial armor, scanning the horizon with a practiced eye. This is the lull before motion, the quiet heartbeat before the pulse of the hunt erupts. Even now, the forest itself seems to conspire with the royal party. Moss carpets, stones, and muted greens, shadows stretch lazily across the paths, and every rustle, chirp, or whisper adds texture to the anticipation. You realize the hunt is more than chasing beasts. It's a symphony of control, ritual, and subtle communication. And as you trudge onward, feeling the weight of both your curiosity and the damp earth underfoot, you sense the first invisible threads of excitement weaving through the party. By the time the first horn blows, you'll already be deep into a world where history, theater, and nature collide in ways both thrilling and oddly intimate. Hunting gear and armor, explore the elaborate weaponry, gilded horns, and sometimes absurd protective clothing royals wore, and why comfort rarely won. You hardly have time to adjust your footing before the gear begins to assert itself. Every hunter, from the king to the newest squire, seems to carry more than just tools. They carry the history of prestige, superstition, and occasional overindulgence. You trudge past racks of weapons polished until they glint like morning frost, longbows with carved limbs, quivers stuffed with arrows fletched in bright feathers, and hunting daggers whose edges seem to hum with silent threat. Historians still argue whether the impractical length of some bows was meant to improve accuracy or simply to impress onlookers, and as you eye a bow almost taller than yourself, you can't help but wonder if intimidation worked better than skill. Armor adds another layer of absurdity. You glance at the king's protective garb, plated shoulders and reinforced leather that's as decorative as it is functional. In fringe accounts, some royals reportedly padded their outfits with additional layers not for protection, but to appear larger, like a medieval puffed-up peacock, a subtle flex over rival courts. You try shifting your own cumbersome jacket, thinking about how modern hiking jackets have nothing on this complexity, and suppress a chuckle as a squire nearby struggles with a gauntlet that seems glued to his hand. Comfort is an afterthought, spectacle dominates. Horns, too, are fascinating in their dual role. The main hunting horn is both instrument and status symbol, polished to perfection, sometimes adorned with precious metals or inlaid with the family crest. Their calls communicate commands across hundreds of yards, a necessity when chasing fleet-footed deer or boar through thick underbrush. Yet fringe historians suggest some horns were so elaborately carved that they were almost ceremonial, less about signaling and more about demonstrating wealth and craftsmanship. You trace your fingers along the smooth curves of one particularly ornate horn, imagining the sound echoing across the forest, startling animals and humans alike. Boots and gloves, often overlooked, have their own peculiarities. Sturdy leather boots may be reinforced with metal, not just for durability, but also to prevent embarrassment should a royal stumble in mud. Gloves are fingered tightly, sometimes stiff with wax or oil, offering little dexterity but maximum presentation. You flex your own fingers experimentally, imagining the frustration of trying to knock an arrow with a glove that resists every movement. It's a funny, relatable moment. Even kings probably winced at such minor annoyances. In the midst of all this preparation, horses demand attention. Each mount is groomed meticulously, manes braided, hooves polished until they shine like wet stone. Some nobles insisted their horses wear decorative coverings, with bells or cloth emblazoned with the family crest. Fringe tailies describe a count who once had his horse adorned with tiny mirrors to confuse the prey, though scholars debate whether this ever truly happened or is just amusing embellishment. Either way, you can't help but notice the slight vanity even in the animals, majestic, patient, and somehow fully aware of their ceremonial importance. Weapons receive further attention as arrowheads are sharpened, daggers tested, and hunting spears balanced. You handle a spear carefully, noting the weight distribution and imagining the strength required to use it effectively. The falconer nearby adjusts a glove for his raptor, murmuring quietly, almost like negotiating a fragile truce. Every piece of equipment carries both practicality and symbolism. To touch it is to understand centuries of tradition, pride, and sometimes over-the-top showmanship. Even minor missteps, dropping a glove, misfiring an arrow, could embarrass a participant in front of nobles whose egos rival the forest's ancient trees. Clothing beyond armor is equally theatrical. Tunics embroidered with gold thread, leggings dyed in bright colors, and cloaks flowing like shadows through the trees all combine to make the hunters appear almost otherworldly. Fringe historical tidbits suggest that some garments were scented with herbs to attract deer or boars. Lavender, rosemary, even crushed juniper, though the effectiveness is disputed, and historians still argue whether these scents actually influenced animal behavior or merely served as a fragrant fashion statement. You catch a hint of rosemary yourself, and it oddly mixes with the earthy forest aroma, creating a surreal, almost dreamlike ambience. Squires flit between hunters, adjusting straps, offering water, and quietly correcting mistakes. Their role is pivotal yet invisible, a shadow presence whose labor enables the spectacle. You realize that without these assistants, the hunt would descend into chaos, the armor would chafe, the weapons would falter, and the entire social theater would collapse into mud and embarrassment. It's a reminder that every royal display is underpinned by unglamorous, tireless effort, a reality often hidden behind the glittering armor and ceremonial horns. Finally, the ensemble reaches its apex when the entire party gathers for inspection. The king surveys the hunters, checking postures, weapon readiness, and even the alignment of feathers in quivers. The forest seems to pause in reverent anticipation.